Thank you once again for joining us on this Sunday. I'm your host, Karal Lahara. Let's get into some international news that we are monitoring. Take a look at this here on your screen, some video and a story that we are following. Three Americans, two Spaniards, and a Czech citizen reportedly arrested in Venezuela, accused of plotting to assassinate President Nicolás Maduro. The arrests were announced by state TV in Venezuela's Interior Ministry on Saturday. Now, the group accused of being part of an alleged CIA plot to overthrow the Venezuelan government and kill members of its leadership. Rifles and ammo reportedly confiscated during the arrest were on display during that announcement. You can see them there on your screen. The State Department has confirmed a member of the U.S. military has been detained in the South American country. A spokesman saying they're also aware of, quote, unconfirmed reports of the detention of two additional U.S. citizens. In a statement, the spokesman is saying, quote, any claims of U.S. involvement in a plot to overthrow Maduro are categorically false. These alleged arrests come 2 days after the U.S. imposed sanctions on 16 of Maduro's allies, who the U.S. government accused of interfering with Venezuela's recent presidential election. So a lot to get to, a lot of developments. For more on this, I would like to bring into the conversation now the Professor Brian Fonseca, director of the Jack D. Gordon Institute for Public Policy at Florida International University. Brian, thanks so much for taking the time to speak with us today. As I mentioned, a lot to get to. But let's first start with this, these new sanctions against Venezuela that the U.S. has imposed. So what is the goal of these sanctions, and if you can detail them for our viewers?
Sure. So just earlier this week, the U.S. levied about 16 additional targeted sanctions. These are sanctions levied to the Maduro government, have aided in the government's ability to hijack the recent elections that took place on 28 July. The purpose of these sanctions is to essentially apply additional pressure to the regime in the hopes that they can get the regime to negotiating tables and find a pathway to a peaceful solution. This is not the first time the United States has levied sanctions. We've levied hundreds of sanctions over the years, targeted at individuals in the political elite, around the political elite, those that have contributed to the dire situation of the country today. And again, it's important to point out that these targeted sanctions are different than sectoral sanctions. In the past, the United States has sanctioned Venezuelan oil, for example. These are not those types of sanctions. Instead, these are sanctions targeted at freezing the money of individuals and freezing sort of the ability of individuals to move around the world.
So these arrests coming on the heels of those sanctions, the ones that I just mentioned, where a U.S. citizen is detained there in Venezuela, is this suspicious activity to you at all? Is this something that you expected from the Maduro regime? Could negotiations come from this?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I think you're absolutely onto something there. Historically, Venezuela has arrested American citizens, of course, claiming the same sort of line of narrative now that these individuals were attempting to undermine the Venezuelan government in some form or fashion. But the Venezuelan government has leveraged these arrests as a means of bringing the Americans to the negotiation table in the hopes of having things like sanctions lifted. If you remember, late last year, the Americans have negotiated the swap of roughly 10 American citizens that were essentially arrested, detained by the Venezuelan government prior, in the hopes of sanctions relief, which again negotiations took place. Venezuelans received a temporary reprieve in sectoral sanctions on Venezuelan oil. In exchange, Americans got roughly 10 hostages back, and so hostages have been leveraged historically for negotiating, in this case, negotiating to lift sanctions.
Let's talk a little bit about Venezuela's current allies and maybe their status with the U.S. Are they similarly facing restrictions like what we're seeing the U.S. is imposing on Venezuela?
Yeah, that's right. Most are. The allies that you might be referring to include Russia, China, Iran, Cuba. Of course, Cuba has had heavy sanctions since the 60s. Iranian oil has been sanctioned as well, and there have been targeted sanctions against Iran. More recently, there have been an increase in sanctions against Russia, particularly post the invasion of Ukraine. And in fact, many argue that the invasion of Ukraine and the efforts to put sanctions on Russia required the United States to look at Venezuela and consider reprieving some sanctions on Venezuela, because the three countries I just named, Iran, Russia, and Venezuela, are producers of heavy crude and move oil into the global oil markets. And so there's been some challenges in terms of the ability to levy sanctions against all of them. Of course, you've heard a lot recently about the increased tariffs against China. So the United States continues to use financial tools, not just against Venezuela, but against Venezuelan allies.
I want to turn to another big headline that we saw just a few days ago. Maduro's plane was seized, I believe, in the Dominican Republic. Right now, the U.S. having control of that plane. I want to put up some of this footage that we have here. Talk to us about this strategy from the United States. What do they hope to accomplish with the seizure of his plane?
Yeah, it's a great question. That happened. It did happen in Dominican Republic recently. Again, this is pressure that the United States is placing on Venezuela, attempting to put whatever kind of pressure they can. Seizing his plane in Dominican Republic was just part of the portfolio of pressure, trying to signal to the regime that the United States is going to continue to attempt to suffocate Venezuela in the international community. And again, it's not unprecedented to do things like this. But certainly, I think the Americans would have hoped Maduro would have been on the plane, because Maduro has been indicted in the United States on trafficking charges. And so I think, again, this is part of the U.S. efforts to put pressure on Maduro. And again, there are only so many tools they can use to put pressure. Sanctions is one, diplomatic, rhetoric, joint statements in multilateral fora like the United Nations and the OAS, and of course, seizing the President Maduro's plane was another one of those efforts.
Another major headline that we do have to talk about here: the opposition leader Edmundo Gonzalez now in Spain in exile. Is this something that you expected given the climate down there in Venezuela?
I think so. I mean, I think immediately after 28 July, a lot of analysts expected the Maduro regime to levy heavy pressure on opposition within the country. And part of this pressure was designed to address the massive social unrest that was happening across the country. Those supporters of the opposition that were pouring into the streets, in pursuit of, again, applying pressure to Maduro and demanding change with Maduro. And of course, Maduro needed, at least perceived the need to, target opposition leaders in the hopes of trying to address some of that mobilization taking place in the streets. Right now, most all of the major opposition leaders are out of the country, Edmundo being the last to leave for Spain just a few days ago. The only opposition leader left in Venezuela is, of course, Maria Corina Machado, who remains one of the biggest persons and leaders of the opposition. She has a tendency to be able to inspire lots of people out into the streets. Of course, she's in hiding right now because the Maduro government has continued to attack and pursue opposition leaders in the efforts of either jailing them or exiling them out of the country. And again, this is all designed to try to get the opposition unrest under control, because Maduro has no intention of allowing a transition back to democracy to occur at this time.
Speaking about the opposition and all of these supporters of that opposition leadership, what are they thinking right now down there in Venezuela? As you just mentioned, Maria Corina Machado, she is in hiding. Edmundo Gonzalez is in Spain. What does that do maybe for the hope of people down there that were hoping that perhaps they could get Maduro out of that presidential regime and bring in this new era forward?
That's a great question. I think, again, it might signal a decline in hope among the opposition. I mean, so far, the opposition has been very capable and intense in terms of its ability to move into the streets and demand change. Not having opposition leaders in country to rally those movements tends to erode those movements and that social pressure over time, which is, of course, what Maduro is trying to do. He's trying to erode the intensity and size of the opposition and the social unrest in the streets as a means of gaining control and continuing to move further away from transition back to democracy. And again, that's the challenge that I think Venezuelans are facing right now, is there aren't many left in the country to rally people in the streets, inspire people in the streets in ways that it continues to put enormous pressure on the government, the political elite, Maduro, the military and security institutions. And I think that's the biggest challenge that Venezuelans in country face. And as of now, the opposition that's out of the country is going to continue to work through the international community to apply that pressure from outside. Of course, El Mundo has already met with leadership in Spain. Opposition leaders like Juan Guaidó here in the United States continues to work with and through the United States to apply pressure. And so opposition that go into exile tend to become activists in the countries that they're in an effort to put that pressure, international pressure anyway, back on Venezuela.
Brian, so many developments when it comes to this story of weeks after this presidential election. Still so many calls, so much unrest when it comes to the people down there in the Latin American country, but really the global community at large that is watching this very closely. Is there anything that you feel that you'd like to add before I let you go? Anything we might have missed or something that you think our viewers should keep an eye out for in the coming weeks?
No, but the continued repression by the regime continues to cost, lives in Venezuela. We've seen dozens killed over the last, month and a half since the 28 July election. We've seen thousands detained and arrested. So the human rights violations continue to persist. And I think, again, the international community needs to continue to find ways to isolate Maduro and push Maduro towards some type of peaceful solution in an effort to allow voices in Venezuela to determine the path that they want under, the context of democracy. And I think that is not going to happen unless there is enormous pressure from outside, but also enormous pressure from inside. Venezuelans are going to have to take this fight further and continue to demand internally, that Maduro hand power over, try to fracture the political elite, try to fracture the armed forces or security services, which continue to hold a grip or enable Maduro to hold a grip on power. And I think that the international community needs to continue to highlight this. Organizations like yours and Fox need to continue to keep a spotlight on the human rights violations and continue to place pressure on the regime, demanding transition back to democracy.
Brian Fonseca, the director of the Institute for Public Policy at Florida International University. We always appreciate your insight as we follow this delicate story out of Venezuela. Take care. We'll talk soon.
Thank you.
Of course. And as Brian was just mentioning, there continues to be international pressure based on this situation in Venezuela. Earlier this week, we did get a joint statement from the United Nations on that entire process. Let's listen into some of those remarks, very brief, next.
And by independent observers show a different outcome than that reported by Venezuela's National Electoral Council, CNE. In light of the ruling by Venezuela's Supreme Court, we urge the CNE to immediately publish the presidential election voting results from all polling stations and allow for the impartial verification of results by independent observers to promote credibility, legitimacy, and transparent electoral process. We take note of the United Nations panel of experts interim report, which found that the electoral process fell short of the basic transparency and integrity measures essential to holding credible elections. The panel reviewed a sample of the actas in the public domain, which exhibited all the security features of the original result protocols. Now is the time for all Venezuelans to begin constructive and inclusive discussions to resolve this electoral impasse and restore democratic norms peacefully in accordance with Venezuelan electoral law and the wishes of the Venezuelan people. we are gravely concerned about the reported human rights abuses and violations following the elections, including those involving repression, arbitrary arrests and detentions, killings, denial of a fair trial guarantees, as well as intimidation tactics against the democratic opposition, including the raid of the opposition's headquarters. We express deep concern with the politically motivated arrest warrant by Venezuelan authorities issued on September 3rd for Edmundo González Urrutia that has forced him into exile. It is imperative to promote respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms in Venezuela, including the right of individuals to assemble peacefully without reprisal. On August 16, the OAS resolution, which passed by consensus, made the region's position clear. Our statement and actions at the United Nations, the OAS, and elsewhere are a testament to the strength of member states' commitment to promoting human rights and the rule of law. We fully support an inclusive Venezuelan-led process to reestablish democratic norms in Venezuela and stand by the millions of Venezuelans who continue to risk their life and well-being for a more democratic, prosperous, and secure Venezuela. Thank you very much.
Minister, Javier Ortazo from FN News, where are you preparing or promoting a resolution on the elections of Venezuela, on the situation of Venezuela?
Here today?
Yes, not today.
No, we are just reading the statement because, as you know, even though we have an enormous number of countries here, we are in different stages in the Venezuelan process. For example, Panama has its own position, so I cannot talk before you because our position is well different to some of the countries here, even though we share the same goal, the restore of the democracy in Venezuela.
And what can the United Nations do at this moment?
The United Nations is promoting the fight for democracy in Venezuela, is promoting the fight for the rule of law, is promoting the respect for human rights.
Right, listening there to that brief joint statement that we had from earlier this week, courtesy of members from the United Nations, as the unrest continues after the presidential election in Venezuela. We're going to step away for our final commercial break of this hour. More to come here on Live Now from Fox.